Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for another Climate Live K12 session for students, educators, and the public. This is a series by the Columbia Climate School. My name is Niklaus Smith, and I will be facilitating the session today. I'm a part of the Columbia Climate School in a couple different capacities. I am finishing up with the MA in Climate Society as the second class to kind of confer the degree now through the Columbia Climate School. And I also work part-time in the admissions office, kind of recruiting the next class. My research background is in carbon dioxide removal and climate mitigation strategies. And I'm working at a climate tech startup right now, but really happy to be here today and kind of facilitate this discussion and have Paul come on and impart some of his wisdom to us. So for those of you unfamiliar with the Columbia Climate School or joining us for the first time, the Columbia Climate School is a newly established school at Columbia University for transdisciplinary climate research. So the school kind of marshals in the university's strengths in basic and applied disciplines and expands its resources to understand climate and its impact on society, develop and inspire knowledge-based solutions, and educate future leaders for just and prosperous societies on a healthy planet. The Columbia Climate School is the first new school at Columbia in over 25 years by incorporating more than 20 different centers and over 700 people who collaborate among so many different departments at the university. So we're all able to better connect, amplify, and kind of advance new areas of climate inquiry, research, and impact across Columbia and beyond. So what we're kind of hoping to do with these Climate Live K12 sessions is to introduce you all to our interdisciplinary work through our different scientific experts. So these monthly sessions will run throughout the academic school year. And if you want any more information about the sessions, you can go on to the website. That's climate.columbia.edu. Or contact us at learn@climate.columbia.edu. So each time that we do one of these, a certain topic is going to be discussed and kind of be directed toward a certain age range. But I think we have the immense pleasure of having Paul Gallay today with us. Today's session is Harnessing the Power of Communities to Fight Flooding and Protect Our Waterways. Paul is a senior staff associate and resilient coastal communities project leader for the Center for Sustainable Urban Development. So I think without further ado, I'll turn it over to Paul to get us started. Yeah, I think we'll have time for questions at the end. So please use the Q&A box as the chat, I believe, is disabled. And so the session is being recorded and we will send participants a link for this recording after it's complete. But yeah, welcome, Paul, and feel free to share your screen and get started whenever.
Yeah, thanks, Nicholas, and greetings to everybody who has tuned in. I'm going to talk for about a half hour. I'll share my screen in just a moment, but before I do, I'll tell you just a little bit about myself so you have a sense as to how I came to this work, because, you know, some of you are going to be giving talks like this, and you might want to know, you know, what are the steps in a career that could lead to teaching at the climate school, which is a really great pleasure. And so I started off actually at law school. After I got a law degree, I briefly worked in private practice for a law firm. Then I moved over to the New York State Attorney General's office and worked in the Environmental Protection Bureau for 3 years, working with the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation as my client. Then for 10 years, I worked at the Department of Environmental Conservation. After 13 years in government, I moved over to nonprofit service. I did a decade in land conservation, and after that, 11 years in clean water advocacy for the group Hudson Riverkeeper. And during that time, I taught at Columbia and Williams College and Clarkson University as an adjunct professor, and eventually had the opportunity 2 years ago to come join Columbia Climate School for real and for true. I had been at Riverkeeper for 11 years. And it seemed like I was due for a change, and maybe the organization too. And now they have a wonderful new Riverkeeper named Tracy Brown. And she started at Riverkeeper on the same day that I started with the Columbia Climate School. So that's pretty fun and cool. So that's who I am. And Nicholas has given you a little bit of a sense for the work that I do. I'm going to talk about it during the PowerPoint. But I think at this point, let's get started with that. See what I can do there. Yeah. Backwards. So, as Nicholas has said, we're going to talk about teaming up for coastal resilience and climate justice in New York City. Those of you who might be tuning in who aren't in New York City, don't worry, it's going to be relevant there too, because a lot of the research findings that we did, I think are universal. I think you're going to see some themes that apply wherever you're trying to get communities in the middle of planning. And getting communities in the middle of planning, as I'll say later on in the presentation, really is essential for the success of that planning. So first, a little general information about climate change and the growing risk of coastal flooding. The flood risks are many. You've got storm surge, sea level rise, stationary storm systems, and I'll show you some images in just a moment that illustrate each of those. And the key here is that it's going to get harder and worse and more expensive. And that's worldwide, and we're no different. Some of the pictures will sort of speak for themselves in a moment, but we're really going to see a lot of increased risk. The last image on this slide is going to be about how things have changed over the last 20 years. And from this, you can sort of see how it's going to get even worse in the coming years. So I promised you that image about how it was, this is 1980, that's 40 plus years ago. If you look at all the storms from flooding and severe storms for like the 3 years between 1980 and 1982, I don't know whether it was as many as 10, probably more like 6 or 7. And then if you look at the storms in the most recent 3 years, I mean, you're talking, probably 15 or 20 a year for a total of 40, 45 over 3 years. So that's quite a jump. And, you can see the line start to grow really seriously in the last 15 years. So it's coming. It's coming is the simple truth. And it's complicated. This is the most important thing to know. We're looking at these major flooding threats that I referred to earlier, and any flood protection measure we put in place has got to address these 3 distinct problems. Ocean waters blown into our communities, as with Superstorm Sandy. Intense rainstorms that just fill up streets like Hurricanes Ida and Henri in 2021. And a lot of people are really concerned about Sandy, and that's definitely something we all should be concerned about. It killed over 50 people in New York, New Jersey. But Hurricane Ida killed almost as many. So it's pretty serious too, and we really have to worry about both of these kind of storms. Plus, with the sea levels rising, we have to worry about flooding that happens when there isn't even a storm. It could be a blue sky day. They call them king tides. It's based on the position of the moon and the gravitational pull of the moon. And one of the pictures I'm going to show you is of those king tides. So first, there's Sandy. This is in the Rockaways. There's no denying the awesome and terrible power of a storm like Sandy. Wall of water 10 to 14 feet high, and the damage it has caused. And the folks who suffered in Hurricane Ida, which is this latest image, they may not have seen that wind-driven storm surge, but they suffered as well. And some of them lost their lives, and many of them lost their health and were seriously injured in Ida. And this is a picture of what happens about a dozen times a year in South Queens communities like Hamilton Beach and Howard Beach. And it's just the water has come up because, as I said, the position of the tides, position of the moon, and the elevation of the water right into people's communities. So you got these 3 major risks. And you also have a series of complex goals that you want any flooding strategy to deal with. You don't want to just protect public health and safety. You also want to protect the environment. You want to protect our biodiversity. And you are also hoping to protect people's access to waterfronts and develop a storm protection plan that is consistent with people's desire and need to be at the waterfront. Community character and property, obviously that's pretty important. And we're up to 5 major goals because many of you who have studied environmental justice know that there are systems that have been in place for 5 generations that have led to communities having less than they ought and being unfairly disadvantaged and disenfranchised. And so we want whatever planning we do to not only protect communities and protect natural systems, but also address that inequality and build social cohesion. It's a big theme we heard from the folks we talked to, and I'm going to get to that in just a moment. So, you want to talk about the many goals you want to address. This is in the South Bronx. We were last summer, some of the students and I were receiving a guided tour from Arifullah, the executive director of South Bronx Unite. And this is us and the students in the foreground. And then you can sort of barely see some folks who are like the people who live in the community who are in bathing suits. This is their beach. Don't you want to have communities that are both protected from storms and where people have better access to better opportunities to connect with their waterfronts than this? So big goals for these plans. And you'll see in a moment that the Army Corps of Engineers, the federal agency that's mainly responsible for these plans, is talking about putting billions into them. And with that money, we've got to achieve these different goals. So what does success look like? Success is a combination of different solutions. And once I do that, I have to do that to see them. They have to be built in layers. Green infrastructure, which is a way to stop stormwater before it gets into people's homes and basements by getting it into street gardens or keeping it on roofs with roof gardens. Restoring wetlands and other natural areas so that they can take the stormwater. CSO is an acronym for combined sewer overflow. You have to worry about the storm sewer system and the sanitary sewer system getting overwhelmed in storms, but you can store more water if you do a good job of managing this rain and sanitary sewage mix that's called the combined sewer overflow. So again, keep the sanitary system from overflowing. And this is pretty down in the weeds and a little bit gross, but it's pretty important that you understand how many different things we have to focus on to do this job right. We don't want to build out in sensitive areas that are going to lead to more people at greater risk. We want to make sure that building codes can be changed so that stormwater runoff can be handled on the site. And until we do a better job of requiring that, there's going to be more runoff than we really need to have. Going to need to do some buyouts as there were after Hurricane Sandy. And as the water continues to rise, there are going to be some communities that are less and less viable over time. And folks are going to be needing to leave their homes, is the sad truth. One thing I want to say about the buyout programs is it should be the last resort. Communities deserve protection before they should have to think about leaving. Onshore barriers, you're going to see some of those when we talk about the Army Corps' plan for the New York, New Jersey region, and even possibly some in-water barriers. But again, these bottom 3, they should be the last resort. We should do everything we can to keep folks in their community and use natural solutions where we can and be honest about where we can. So Army Corps promises that they like this layered approach, and they have this fancy terminology, high frequency, threat related work, near term. That basically means you're going to see more rainstorms than you are storm surge related hurricanes like Sandy. So they really have to do a plan that applies to all of these threats that I talked about. So what are they doing? Well, they're doing something called the New York, New Jersey Harbor and Tributaries Coastal Storm Risk Management Feasibility Study. And they generally refer to it as the HATS, the Harbor and Tributaries Study. And since it's a mouthful to say everything else I'm going to use that acronym. I don't much care for acronyms, but HATS, we're going to go with it. And as you can see, it's like the largest population for any of these studies. 25 counties in New York, New Jersey, 16 million people. New York City is at the heart of it, but it goes up the Hudson and down into New Jersey and out a little into Long Island. And they're proposing to do a plan that has a combination of different structural measures, non-structural measures, and natural features. You know, the structural measures are essentially in-water barriers and onshore seawalls. And the non-structural measures can be floodproofing and keeping homes in place, or elevating structures, or the relocation that I talked about, where they either relocate utilities and infrastructure or relocate possibly communities through what they call retreat. So non-structural measures is that bucket. And this is the natural and nature-based features where I talked about green infrastructure and increased salt marshes. And you can even build oyster reefs, as they are off Staten Island, that will break the wave energy from the next Superstorm Sandy and reduce storm surge. So this is the combination of factors that they have in their toolkit. And they have a plan. They have a $52 billion plan. And it's pretty much all structural, because it's all storm surge. And this is one of the techniques they're going to use, these in-water barriers. They have a number of them. I'll show you that in just a moment. And then they also have some other measures that they're planning for onshore. So let's look specifically at what they're planning. They're calling it Alternative 3B, the tentatively selected plan. And it's got storm surge barriers that are 2 miles in various locations. I think there's 8 or 9 of them in these small areas around the tributaries. There was some talk about a big storm barrier across the mouth of the Hudson and the mouth of the harbor, but that did not score out for the Army Corps. Plus, I think there were an awful lot of environmental and practical barriers, no pun intended, to building that kind of cross harbor 5-mile wide seawall. They also have 50 miles of onshore barriers. That's the blue here. I'll give you a close-up of that in just a moment. And like I said, $53 billion in cost, 14 years to build. I mean, it's a crazy big project, but they funded a project down in Texas for $30+ billion just last year. So it's not out of the range of possibility we're going to get this support. There has to be support from the state of New York and the state of New Jersey with funding, but the Army Corps can fund the majority of it. So this is a schematic from the Army Corps' tentatively selected plan of what it would look to put a barrier across the mouth of Jamaica Bay. And it's the largest of the barriers. I think that it is 3,800 feet, so that's like 3/4 of a mile almost. And that too is a major engineering feat that would be coupled with a lot of other measures to try to protect the communities around Jamaica Bay. And the communities in the Rockaways, very densely populated areas, are going to need protection. But the question is, do you need the storm barrier? There are researchers who have said that you could recontour the bottom of the inlet and reduce the storm surge enough so that you wouldn't necessarily need these barriers. So that's an alternative we're hoping actually the Army Corps will study even further. I talked about the onshore barriers. This is southern Manhattan. It's an awful lot of residents and businesses that are seeking protection in lower Manhattan. And the way the Army Corps proposes to do that is through these onshore barriers. Trick is that the onshore barriers can end up looking like this. So there are a lot of folks in communities say, do I have to get that kind of onshore barrier protection? There are some areas in lower Manhattan on the east side that are getting collapsible walls. And, you know, frankly, if you're going to get a seawall on shore, folks are going to be looking for that rather than this. So what about Columbia? You know, what are we all about in terms of this whole mix of possibly tens of billions of dollars being invested in dealing with these different flood risks and facilitating increased justice and community cohesion and protecting not only people and their lives and their properties, but also natural ecosystems. Well, I started with Columbia just about the same time that President Bollinger, who's completing a 21-year run at Columbia, has come up with this idea of the fourth purpose of the university. And it's very fancy jargon. And, what it really comes down to is, can we really afford to just be in the ivory tower? That's the slang for, you're at Columbia, you've got this nice opportunity to do amazing research, but don't you need to get that research right in to studies like the harbor and tributary study and marry your research together with the practice of designing the best possible solutions in real time? Because do we really have time to wait for that research to get published, for the publications to get to the hands of the folks who are making the decisions? No, we got to get it in place immediately. So that's why I came to Columbia, and that's why I formed something called the Resilient Coastal Communities Project, which is, and this is something I'm super excited about, it's a partnership between the Columbia Climate School and the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance. New York City Environmental Justice Alliance is the oldest and broadest environmental justice organization focusing on the 5 boroughs. And they have 12 members. I think they're in the process of getting another member even as we speak. And so we don't do anything without first doing it jointly with New York City Environmental Justice Alliance. That's like the only other acronym I'm going to use, because they like to call themselves NEJA. So I'm going to call them NEJA. So NEJA and the Climate School came up with this research project. We're addressing the challenges of coastal resilience through research, which I'm going to present to you in just a moment. Support for community empowerment and public planning. I think I got a picture coming up of some work we've done right with the Army Corps. Publications, workshops, and other convenings. Here's a link to the publication, and hopefully Adrian or Nicholas can share this deck with you afterwards, so that you can check out the QR code, or you can just go to our webpage, and it's all loaded on the webpage for the Resilient Coastal Communities Project, pretty easily searchable. But this is like when we had the Army Corps. There's this fellow, Colonel Matthew Lozado, in uniform here. He's the commander of the New York district, and he's in charge of this $52 billion study. And all these other folks on this side of the room are Army Corps folks. These are all researchers from Columbia. So we're really trying to live that fourth purpose, making a difference in real time by helping the Army Corps understand what we've learned about community engagement and connecting them with our physical scientists who are doing studies of sea level rise, storm surge, and these different alternatives for assuring that the plan they come up with is the best suited for all of our risks. So here's the research I talked about, and I think this is really important to spend some time with before we get back to that HATS study and where it goes from here. Because, the simple truth is that when we talk to 10 environmental and climate justice organizations, and this is who they are towards the bottom, and ask them, tell us about your experience in resiliency planning. How does it feel to be the subject of harbor and tributary study? Are they planning for you? Are they planning with you? What needs to be done better? What resources do you need to participate effectively? And we got an earful. I mean, we talked to these folks throughout the New York City region, and also several in New Jersey, Ironbound Community Corporation and New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance. And it was really awesome to get that intelligence from them as to what it feels like to be in the middle of this planning. Because, if you take one thing away from this whole section of the talk, it's that communities need to be brought to the table for meaningful dialogue. Agencies need to be accountable to those communities. And if you have a meaningful dialogue and the agencies are accountable, you'll have real community empowerment. And they'll see themselves in the plan that gets created. So ongoing dialogue, agency accountability, and community empowerment in the final plan. And after we did all the interviews with these 10 groups, we followed up with them a couple of times show them what we think that they said to us, and ask, did we hear you right? Do you hear yourselves in what we're saying back to you? And we had our own goals of being accountable and empowering. And nothing we published did we publish without giving it first in draft to our interviewees and making sure we got their sense as to, did we get it right or did we get it wrong? And so we shared our findings. We're being invited to give these presentations in planning conferences in Florida, New Jersey, by Columbia, by Fordham University. And I think people really understand that the whole central theory of this project, which is if you plan with communities, you'll make better plans. Agencies know things, the communities don't. Not a lot of scientific modelers working in the different members organizations of the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance. But those organizations know things that agencies don't about their communities. And they're the ones who can guide a truly effective plan. So we're really trying to be everywhere we possibly can and give presentations like this. These are the questions we asked, and I'm just going to be quiet for a second, take a drink of water, and let you look at these questions. Because, you know, you guys, some of you are doing research, some of you will be doing research. Some of you is like, oh, I'd like to know about it, but I don't want to do it. So these are the sorts of questions you ask. Okay, so what did we hear? What did we get as findings? What did people tell us? Well, the first finding is that communities are fighting an uphill battle. Systemic forces are undermining their safety and their security. First, you got the fact that flood risk is just one of the major risks folks are facing, with or without climate change. You know, we're a week away from smokepocalypse. I don't have to tell you about the risks communities face. We all face them, whatever part of the city or metropolitan area we're in, or most of the East Coast, if you're not listening from the, you know, New York City. So you've got risks related to heat, you've got risk related to fire, you've got risk related to structural racism, housing insecurity, the lack of effective investment in communities that were redlined 100 years ago, the lack of the ability to pass on intergenerational wealth. And the data on this is extremely robust, which is a fancy way of saying there's fact after fact after fact proving this. Everybody wishes that it weren't so, that we weren't facing structural racism. Some people take it very personally. They shouldn't. The truth will set you free, and it'll allow you to create policies that build fairness and build justice and allow us to live up to our, you know, principles as a nation and as a region. So all these different problems are made worse by this history of unfair discrimination and this history of lack of access to the levers of power. One of the findings I'm going to talk about later is how frustrating it is to be part of a disadvantaged community. And that's the statutory term these days. Disadvantaged community sounds a little weird to say, but that's the term that the federal and state statutes are using for the communities that are plagued by these problems and the structural unfairness. So you're from one of these communities, you don't have access to planners the way that folks do in more well-to-do communities. And so that's why planning consistently underplays the concerns of these communities. And these are some of the voices that we heard. And I think it's important to pause. And again, I want you to sort of imagine folks saying this. I don't want it to be my voice saying this. I want you to think of the people who said this to me. Kelly VR of the Staten Island Urban Center. This one is name withheld because I guess they're concerned that there would be backlash if they spoke the truth. They say that it's okay in the city's eyes to flood our communities to protect others. Kelly from SIUC said, we're just about to lose the protection we had when we had Sandy for a store. And this is from the good old Lower East Side. That's what GOAL stands for. And they're on Lower East Side of Manhattan. And the plan that's being built that I showed you in one of the early slides is a plan that the city basically foisted on the community after promise to do a plan with the community. And it didn't end up being that at all. More findings. Folks have their own plans. South Bronx Unite. This is a map of plans. There are 30 or 40 plans in New York City alone. These are the plans that were created by our interviewee organizations. And they're awesome plans. And they're not being given the seriousness that they deserve by the agency planners who are coming up with the plans that are going to get funding. So this is something that we have to fight if we want to do dialogue, accountability, and empowerment. So this is one of the things that we're really concerned about. And, you know, last finding is you're going to have to change the power dynamics of resilience planning if you're going to have justice, if you're going to have all the work that's been done in these communities and all the expertise they have really come into play. So I guess I have to do that first. If you do it, if you give people some control, you get a better plan by coupling government expertise, all those modelers, with community wisdom, the people who know where the flooding threats are the greatest, the people who know where the storm sewers back up the most. And without frontline community involvement, you're just going to have a continuing deepening division between the privileged groups that have access and those that don't have access. And communities are really frustrated that they're not getting a seat at the table, but what choice do they have? They have to come back to the table. And what they're really trying to do is to get the agencies not to bring them something that's done already, but to plan with them. No more top-down planning. That was a message that came through so clearly. And they want capacity. They want to be given the resources to participate effectively. They don't want folks coming into their community briefly and saying, we're the government, we're here to help. We're Columbia University, we're here to help. They want funding for capacity building in communities, and they want a true and equal partnership. Recommendations. Yeah, let's do some recommendations. We've learned from communities, and how can we improve the process? Well, agencies are always giving public engagement too little time and then saying, well, we talked to the community. Yeah, you talked to the community. You didn't talk with the community. You didn't have the dialogue. You didn't give them feedback to what they told you. You didn't deliver accountability. Provide financial support. We talked about that just a moment ago. And the agencies have got to devote their own resources. They need to provide financial support at the agency level for dialogue, accountability, and empowerment. And this is a hyperlink, and I actually hope that you get this PowerPoint because, you know, I don't have time to do it, but I could play the head of the Army Corps, that guy in the uniform, Matt Lozado, saying at one of the public meetings around the harbor and tributaries study, everything I talk about today is going to be about dialogue, accountability, and empowerment. But they don't have the staff, and they haven't delivered. And they won't be able to deliver if they don't assign the staff. So public comment periods around things like the harbor and tributary study, yeah, if they make the plan better, great. If they do the dialogue, accountability, and empowerment, great. But you really need to have this be a permanent collaborative planning process, not just when you're developing the harbor and tributary study, but when you're getting it funded, when you're getting it built, when you're seeing how it's working. There needs to be a consistent dialogue. And this is not rocket science. You know, I don't have to only present this to fellow faculty or agency types. I think this is really pretty consistent with what you learn, not necessarily from middle school, but maybe, and certainly in high school, certainly undergraduate, certainly when you're doing your graduate work. So why aren't we doing these things? Why aren't we putting communities at the center of the planning process? Why aren't we creating plans that communities recognize themselves in? There's just no good answer to that, except that we have a structural deficit for community input. It's the same way we have a structural problem with systemic inequality and racism. So this is one of the last screens I'm going to show you. This is the comments that Climate School put in with NEJA. Again, every time I see something that we put in side by side with NEJA, and you know, this is like a 20-page comment letter on the harbor and tributary study. And I can tell you, it's more drafted than NEJA than it was by Columbia. And that is something that I consider to be really essential. You can't speak for communities, whether you're government or academia. You can do the dialogue, you can be accountable, and you can empower them to speak in a way where they might get heard. And here are the 4 points. I don't know how clearly this comes across on the screen. Be just. Provide community engagement and distribute flood protections justly. Be comprehensive. Look at storm surge, sea level rise, and rainfall. Be restorative. Don't just protect communities from flooding. Provide for a stronger ecology. Provide for social benefit, greater social cohesion. And just go back to justice. Provide protection for more communities. It's only 63% of the communities that are getting protection. And some of them, like Hunts Point in the Bronx, not getting any protection. So, final stretch. What does it look like? This is kind of like summarizing everything I said over the last 20 minutes. You know, you don't just center communities by snapping your fingers. You got to build awareness. You got to make connections in communities. You got to figure out who are the folks who can support just and equitable outcomes. And you got to give them the capacity to participate effectively. How cruel would it be to say, oh, you're important in the process, so come to this meeting, and they've got another job, or they don't have the expertise to hire the folks who can have them sit effectively at that table. And by the way, build that table in a different way. You know, sure, the Army Corps has got all these formal structures, but you got to create your own table sometimes as the community. You got to basically take the process on yourself so that you'll have meaningful input, even if you have to grab it out of their hands. 2 more. Build project ownership at the local level. Why are we doing any of this? It's to support communities through actually having a plan that has their fingerprints on it, that has their priorities front and center, that has them working side by side with these agency folks. And then build it out regionally. Go middle out. Go to the regional and national level and share best practices and create a more robust network of community organizations succeeding across the country and beyond. And this is one of the meetings that we had with the state of New York, state of New Jersey, and the city of New York. And the voices here are from national environmental groups, and they're from regional environmental justice organizations. They're from local organizations that focus on nature. They're from local organizations that focus on environmental justice. And this is one last quote from the folks that we worked with at the Point CDC in Hunts Point, where, you know, they're not getting protection from the Army Corps. If we're not moving at the speed that our people need us to move in, if we're not accommodating their needs, all the policy in the world, without that community power, we're going to hit a wall. And they don't mean one of those walls that the Army Corps wants to build. It means a wall that means that we don't protect ourselves from these very serious and growing risks. So a couple of necessary conditions for just, effective resilience planning. Fortunately, there is a strong legal framework requiring collaboration. It's called the Water Resources Development Act. Is there agency cooperation? Ish. They really understand they have the obligation to do this. The Colonel talked about dialogue, accountability, and empowerment, but they're still not delivering it yet. Is there funding for community participation? Not even ish. It's not there yet, and we're working with Congress to get it. Have agreed upon goals been established? You know, frankly, the Army Corps is still focusing on storm surge and not on these other threats. So we're not there yet. I'm sure you can tell, but you know, you got to fight. You got to fight. That's what I found, both when I was at the agency and folks were fighting to get me to do a better job, and when I was at Riverkeeper and I was fighting to get them to do a better job. But you got to do it in partnership, and you got to do it with the time necessary to plan collaboratively. And you got to do it so it goes on after the plan is done and as you're building the project. So here's the vision. This is where we want to go. Last slide. Essential information accessible to all. If you don't have the information, you can't participate effectively. Funding provided, capacity for stakeholders. If you have the information, but you don't have the funding, you can't participate effectively. Networks and partnerships are created to empower and elevate frontline communities and to help them support one another. Productive and supportive spaces are fostered by the agencies to promote the listening, learning, accountability, and trust needed for effective collaborative planning. That's on the agencies. Their responsibility is to do plans that meet this standard that the kernel put out, and to be accountable and to be empowering. And if the frontline communities involved in the planning process see themselves in the plan and support its funding and implementation, you did your thing. And this is what you could end up with. Imagine a future in which we ourselves are not just existing, but thriving. And we're not just participants, but we're active leaders in really creating and recreating and continuing to develop our region and our communities. That's El Puente from Williamsburg, Brooklyn. So that's what's going on. I'm going to stop the share in just a moment, but I want you to see who else was involved in this work and who helped fund it. And then I guess we got 15 minutes for questions, which was the idea all along. Yay. Okay, so let me stop the share and bring myself up.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Paul. That was super insightful. I've done some course-related research before on nature-based solutions versus seawall construction, and a lot of my personal research, and also a lot of what my job is concentric around right now is public engagement, community engagement around climate mitigation strategies. So to see this also translated into the adaptation sphere is also really, really amazing to see how other people are really considering context-based kind of lenses for this type of work. So I really appreciate that. I suppose I'll kick it off. I could talk about this all day. I feel like I have a million questions, but I'll just kick it off with one question really quick to get everyone started. And everyone, please feel free to populate the Q&A function with any questions that you might have. I see a couple, which we'll get to,
Yeah,
but
I'm looking at them and I'll do them after your question, Nicholas.
Yeah. All right, awesome. I was thinking a lot of what this context-based kind of community involvement for these resilience projects, and you're particularly talking about some historically disadvantaged communities that exist, in Canarsie and Jamaica Bay and the Rockaways. How did your team find kind of bridging the education deficit in these communities? Because if you're coming in with a lot of projected climate impacts, people that may not have a lot of experience with a lot of these terms, how are you able to kind of translate these complex climate projections and information just in general to these impacted communities? I always think that's something that's incredibly interesting, is being able to kind of frame everything towards a specific audience. So was there a certain method that you guys utilized to be able to really translate that information so people can understand you and meet you where you're at a little bit more?
Well, sure. Speak whenever you can, get translation whenever you can. Don't throw around too many acronyms, as I tried not to do today. You got to sort of drink your own Kool-Aid, so to speak. Every time I make a presentation like this, I try to do it in a way where it can provide for dialogue. And I'm glad for these questions, yours and the two I see so far, and hope to get more. But just ask folks what is clear to them and what isn't, and ask them what they need to be able to participate more effectively. And, one of the things Columbia University has authorized for me to do with some colleagues is to select 2 clients a year from communities to help them develop the data that they need to participate effectively. So that's actually a course at Columbia now. So we're doing our best to be empowering, and we're doing our best to work with and side by side with the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, because these interviews always go better when it's not just the university. I'm going to talk about Yanis's 2 questions The first is that, yeah, of course, the moon is influence connected to tidal phenomenon. I apologize if I wasn't clear about that. But long story short is that the reason we only have 12 days a year that some of these so-called king tides come up into communities is because it's when the moon's position is consistent with an additional force of gravity drawing literally drawing this water up into communities in a way that doesn't happen normally. So it is a combination of the position of the tide, position of the moons, and communities know this, and they know this is when you move your cars out of the community and pick up everything you possibly can that you don't want to get flooded. So this second question is really important, which is, won't these be prohibitively expensive solutions? $52 billion is pretty damn expensive. But the reality is that a lot of that money would be coming from the federal government, and it would be coming from taxation that does not fall disproportionately on the folks in the city. And it gets into the question of, do we get enough back for what taxes we put into the federal government? Normally we don't, but this would be a way of having more money come into the city relative to what gets put out. There's a lot of communities that do better on that ratio than we do. So we can actually use this to reduce inequality by drawing federal funds in. So I'm now officially open for business for either typed in questions or verbally expressed conditions. I see a new one from Luciana. What is the most frustrating part of these project developments? Okay, so I'd say it is that the Army Corps was working on this storm-driven plan because of Hurricane Sandy. And, those of us who are involved in Hurricane Sandy know that you really do need to deal with storm surge. But it wasn't all we needed to deal with. And so some of us got together with some members of Congress and got their authorization at the Army Corps broadened to include sea level rise and rain-driven floods. This is like a year or two before Hurricane Ida. And so we expected the Army Corps would broaden their study. And I remember when Mayor Adams said after Ida, I think he wasn't quite mayor yet, but he was mayor-elect, or maybe he was just a candidate. But he said, the plan the Army Corps has for storm surge would have done nothing to protect our communities, including the dozen or so people who lost their lives in basement apartments, because it was all storm surge focused. So the most frustrating thing is that here in 2023, the Army Corps still cares a lot more about storm surge than they do about these other risks, even though Congress has now ordered them twice in 2 different water resource bills to consider all these threats. And if you consider all these threats, frankly, I think you can design solutions synergistically. Sorry for the 10-cent word, but I think you know what I'm trying to say. You can design solutions that reinforce one another and that support one another. And you can do perhaps a little more natural and nature-based solutions and a little less pouring of concrete and building of walls. So I see there's one from Hannah. Are there any drawbacks to nature-based solutions that may impact or harm communities? Not if they're done well, not if they're relied on to the degree that makes sense. You have these oyster reefs or these wetlands being put in place. And if you rely on them to deal with the part of the flood risk that they can handle and not over-rely on them, you can make sure that communities get the benefit of those natural areas, the benefit of living next to nature, the benefit of having healthy ecosystems around them, the benefit of, in many cases, cooling temperatures without the drawbacks of over-reliance and without, frankly, the drawbacks of overbuilding concrete structures. So, great question so far. I hope folks will keep them coming.
I guess I could ask another one while we wait on some other ones to come in. But talking about, one of the main ways of engaging with communities after the offset of the project is by establishing, transparency and clear accessibility to the data. What kind of plans do you guys have in regarding like monitoring and evaluation, M&E, as we call it for a lot of like climate adaptation projects, excuse me, thinking about, how we can use M&E at, the offset, at a midterm evaluation, and at the conclusion of a project to see its effectiveness, and kind of gain more community feedback throughout the process, rather than, there just being a couple of times for public comment, like you mentioned. So what are ways of being able to really publish this transparent data so that communities can see the effectiveness of a project while it's going on?
Well, it's a question that I can answer by saying that the Army Corps met with the Resilient Coastal Communities Project in May of 2022, and we asked that question of them. We said, if you do the things that you just mentioned, Nicholas, you're going to have a better project. You're going to have better community buy-in, and your project's going to work better over time. And they said, well, how about we create a working group which can be focused on both environmental concerns and climate justice concerns? And we said, yeah, please. And so from that meeting in early May 2022, we've been saying, how about that advisory group? How about that advisory group? How about that advisory group? And they promised it in writing. And then all of a sudden it's like, I don't think we can organize it. I don't think we have the funding or the jurisdiction. It's like, oh, come on. So we were really excited when, during the public comment period for the harbor and tributary study, the city of New York, the state of New Jersey, and the state of New York wrote a letter to the Army Corps calling on them to, quote, lead, fund, and facilitate this climate and environmental justice advisory group. And you can be sure that we are going around with our partners saying to everybody who will listen, get the Army Corps to do this advisory group, because they can do exactly the things you just mentioned, Nicholas.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you. Anybody else have any last questions before we begin to wrap up for the evening?
Or want to share their stories? I mean, my Sandy story is not really that terrible. I was bailing water out of my office, but that's not the same. If folks want to share stories, or if they want to say, this is what I want to see in the plan, and this is to some degree an opportunity for folks to weigh in. One thing I'll do is I will put a link to my contact information and the information for the Resilient Coastal Communities Project into the chat. So if you want to check out more or see any of the studies I've been referring to, you can do so without difficulty. So that's what I got.
All right, wonderful. Well, I really appreciate you coming today, Paul, and for imparting some of your wisdom and experience onto us. I really appreciate it. And hope you have a good rest of your evening, and be in touch soon.
Okay, Nicholas and everybody on the line, thank you very much for being here. It's been a pleasure.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening.
Bye
See you soon. Bye.